Good evening and welcome to the center at Camden County College, where, as you know, we share the world with you. And very glad you're able to make it tonight for this very, very important talk. As you know, the first two talks in this series were very good. And it's always good to start off with excellent speakers at the beginning of the series because it means that more people will return, as you did. In any case, please turn off your cell phones. And I want to remind you that you were given a survey form when you entered the auditorium. Please complete that and give it to one of our volunteers at the end of the evening. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to point out some things that are coming up. Our next talk in the Middle East series is on Thursday, October the 3rd, and we're going to show a film that I think you'll find very, very interesting with a speaker commenting on the film. That's part of our new challenges and old issues in the Middle East. Now, we also have a continuing series, as some of you may know, at the Haddonfield Fortnightly, in which Monica Zimmerman, one of the best speakers we've ever had, gives a talk on artists. And I don't think we have another one there for 2 weeks, but it is at the Haddonfield Fortnightly, and it is in the brochure that you probably picked up when you came in. Now, the next lecture in the Russian Challenge from Lenin to Putin is October the 23rd, and it's called The Putin Effect and Russia's Hybrid War on the West by Michael Orenstein of the University of Pennsylvania. Now, in addition to that, as you know, we have an array of mini-courses. Our second session of mini-courses will be starting in 2 weeks, as well as a series on Tuesday nights on autism and also one on addictions. But tonight, I'm very happy that we have, once again, a faculty member from Villanova University, all of whom over the years have been excellent presenters. So we're very happy to host folks from Villanova. Tonight's speaker, Mark Schrad, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Villanova University. He received a bachelor's degree in Political Science, Russian and East European Studies from the University of Northern Iowa, an MA in Russian and East European Studies from Georgetown, and an MA in Political Science and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin. Now, he's published 2 books, a number of scholarly articles, and other articles as well. But it's interesting that among his books, one is The Politics of Power of Bad Ideas, Networks, Institutions, and Global Prohibition Wave, and also Vodka Politics, Alcohol, Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State, both of whom were published by Oxford University Press. Now, anyone who has ever visited Russia knows, for example, that they do drink a bit there. Now, the first time I ever went to the Soviet Union many years ago, I was actually in Ukraine, in Kiev. Went to a nice hotel there the first day, had chicken Kiev for lunch, and then the toasts began, Ukrainian beer and vodka. By the time the lunch was over, I couldn't feel my legs. So it was a very real possibility that was going to be my first and last trip there. But nonetheless, I managed to survive. But maybe we'll have him back sometime to talk about the politics of vodka. As you know, a major social problem with drinking in Russia, and they had one of the lowest life expectancies for men and all sorts of problems. But that's another topic. Tonight, we asked Mark to come and to talk about the election of 2016, 2020, of course, impact on 2020. So please join me in welcoming Mark Schrad to Camden County College.
Hello. I'm Mark. Nice to meet you all. Thanks you all for coming out, and thank you, Jack, for such a wonderful and hospitable introduction. It's been a lot of fun. So yeah, as he was saying, a lot of stuff about me. One, I tend to roam around a lot, but I'm supposed to be by the microphone because they're recording this, so I'll try not to move too far away from the podium at this point. But yeah, so I teach at Villanova. I teach a whole lot of courses in political science, international law, international relations, comparative politics, all these things. But Russia has always been kind of my bread and butter. That's always been the thing that's interested me. Jack and I were talking about it a little bit earlier today, and about this vodka book that I wrote. It's essentially a drunk history of Russia, which is all of Russia. As I was explaining, it's like having beer goggles for Russian history, except when you put on like the vodka goggles, things actually make a little bit more sense in Russian historical terms. And so that was kind of like my long-standing interest for a long time, and it goes from all the way back from Ivan the Terrible straight through the 2012 elections in Russia. So it was a lot of fun to do. And so I've been now at Villanova for like 10 years. And even though I teach all these different courses, people always say, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm at Villanova." "Oh, what do you teach?" "I teach political science." And especially since 2016, like everybody's like, "Oh, political science, that's got to be very interesting right about now." And I'm like, "Yeah, I guess it is." And then they'll probe a little bit more, and they say, "Well, what area of political science do you study?" And I was like, I do Russian politics." And then they go, "Oh, Russia, you must be really in high demand right now." And for a while, I was like, yeah, I must really be in high demand right now. And I was patting myself on the back for apparently making a good decision about career choices about 30 years ago. But the more I thought about it, and the more this scenario kept replaying over and over again, people say, "Whoa, you must be really in high demand with Russia," I started to realize that more and more Americans that I would speak to, friends and students, weren't so much interested in Russia for the sake of being interested in Russia. They were interested in Russia for how it relates to Donald Trump and the 2016 elections. And so once I realized that, I was kind of crestfallen. I'm like, oh, people really aren't interested? Come, let's go learn about communism. Let's go learn about Lenin. Let's go, no. I just want to figure out what's going on in terms of American politics. And so that's kind of been my own experiences in dealing with this broad topic area. And I do have to say, like, when I was writing, and this vodka book came out, 2014. It came, it's been translated in a whole bunch of languages. And as part of that, I thought it would be good to sort of raise sort of the public intellectual profile and write like lots of op-eds and stuff. And I was writing stuff in like the New York Times and Washington Post and all these different places. And then when sort of the build up to the 2016 election happened, and then afterwards with the Mueller Report, I stopped doing that completely because I recognized my own limitations, right? And so yes, I have an academic background. I've got all these degrees. I've spent time. I've lived in Russia. I've lived in Ukraine, but I don't have the firsthand on-the-ground knowledge. I was not in Trump Tower in 2015 with Don Jr. and Natalia Veselnitskaya. I don't have that kind of information. So I was like, I will just let things roll and just keep my mouth shut because I don't want to be one of those people who's out ahead of their skis and is, saying stuff with their mouth that their butt can't cash later on, right? So, however, I've been, incredibly on top of all these different political developments. Every time, like with the Mueller investigation, when there was an indictment, I would just, push past all the media reports and go straight to the indictments and read through the indictments because I thought it was fascinating to see what's going on in these cases, and especially when the Mueller Report itself came out. I was on top of it. I was reading it that morning, and trying to recognize the extent of what was going on, so I could explain it to myself and try to get an understanding of what was going on, but also to obviously be able to turn around and explain it to other people, especially the students in my Russian politics classes. And so that's kind of my own background for this situation. So what I want to do tonight, and just to give you a quick outline of where I plan to go. And this is very open-ended. If we want to go off and veer off and talk about different elements, I can certainly go off and veer as much as we want to. But I want to give like a very brief, thumbnail sketch on the history of U.S.-Russian relations, in the post-Cold War era in particular. I want to talk very briefly about why Russia did this. So that entails just a very brief understanding of what the Russian political system looks like. And then delve into a little bit of the different allegations, what it looks like. And then, of course, in the last week, 2 weeks, things have taken a rather dramatic turn, not only with regards to Russia, but also next door in Ukraine, again, as they relate to American politics. And so if we want to talk about what's going on with Hunter Biden and Ukraine, I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. So that's just kind of a little outline as to what I think is on tap. But we can go in all sorts of different directions, and so we'll see what comes of this whole thing. So just very quickly, this is my quick thumbnail sketch background history of U.S.-Russian relations. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to explain this succinctly. But I do remember in the build-up to 2015, 2016 elections, Donald Trump was going on TV and saying, wouldn't it be great for us to have good relations with Russia? Wouldn't that be awesome to do that? And a lot of people were, I guess for various political reasons, kind of shocked by that whole notion, especially given the fact that Russia had recently occupied Crimea, was involved in the Donbass region. I was not as shocked by that because I recognize that U.S.-Russian relations, especially since the end of the Cold War, is like a roller coaster. We have good periods, and then it goes downhill really quickly. And then we have attempts to try to reset relations, and then it goes downhill really quickly. And these things tend to go in 8-year terms, which is fascinating. And so coming up into the 2016 elections, we were poised to go back up to the top of good relations with Russia. And so what I have in this slide here is just like my own thumbnail sketch of good relations on top, bad relations on bottom. And at the bottom, you can see those little lines I have. The black ones are U.S. presidential elections. And the blue ones are Russian presidential elections. And so you can see how they're kind of timed similarly. And so it was nice for a while. One of the things Putin has done recently is amended the Constitution. And so instead of having 4-year presidential terms, they're not going to move out to 6-year terms. And so my nice little dovetailing with U.S. elections thing is going to get all messed up now. And so I don't know how I'm going to teach this in the future. Anyway, so if you go back to the 1980s, obviously the Cold War era, things were not particularly good. But as you're getting into 87, 88, 89, and you have increasingly warm relations between Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan, and then after that President George H.W. Bush, things are warming up, and things get better and better and better to the point where Reagan says they're not an evil empire anymore, and everything is just perfectly fine. And even after the Soviet Union falls apart and Gorbachev gets replaced by Boris Yeltsin in 1991, 1992, there is this euphoria. We're all on the same side. U.S. and Russia, we're all open and freedom-loving Democrats now. Isn't it just going to be great? And oh, by the way, can you loan us about $50 billion? Because we have the system. If you could give us a Marshall Plan, like you guys did for Germany after World War II, that'd be great. As it turns out, that wasn't forthcoming, and so throughout much of the 1990s, the situation goes down and down and deteriorates and deteriorates. And so by the time you get to about 1998, you have the war, the NATO war in Kosovo, and you have the situation where Yeltsin was protecting the Serbs, and you actually have a confrontation between Russian troops on the ground in Kosovo and NATO troops, and so that was a pretty low point of that as that was going on. 1998, obviously you have something of a transition, and you have Yeltsin is on his way out, and then we have this guy Vladimir Putin comes in, and that's also about the time that we're transitioning from the Clinton administration into the George W. Bush administration. Dovetailing fairly nicely in that way. And obviously 9/11 to 2001 is an incredible disaster, as we all know. But if there is one silver lining in all this, it was an improvement in U.S.-Russian relations. As you probably know, or maybe you don't, the very first person, international leader, to call up George W. Bush on Air Force One as they're flying about on 9/11 is Vladimir Putin. And he has come prepared with assistance, intelligence sharing. When it comes to the war in Afghanistan, they're offering routes for supply lines, the so-called Northern Route, marshaling all this stuff. So it looks like we're all on the same page again. Wonderful. U.S. and Russia, buddy, fighting terrorists. It's going to be awesome. And then things go downhill fairly quickly after that. By 2003, you have the Iraq War. The Russians aren't particularly happy about this idea of deposing Saddam Hussein, especially since it had nothing to do with 9/11. So they were very vocal in their opposition, and that led to a deterioration in relations that keeps going down and down and down until you get to 2008. During the 2008 Olympics, that's when Russia essentially rolls its tanks into its southern neighbor of Georgia, and so we have a bottoming out of relations yet again. So that's the end of the George W. Bush years, right into the beginning of the Barack Obama administration, and that's also the end of Putin's second term. And according to the Russian Constitution, you can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms. And so he negotiates this thing with his prime minister, kind of his second in command, Dmitry Medvedev, and says, in a very choreographed way, he gets up and says, I can't run for president again. I am going to support Dmitry Medvedev. His poll numbers go from who? To 80% approval rate overnight. Medvedev says, I couldn't possibly run unless you're my prime minister. And Putin says, yes, I'll be your prime minister. And they swap positions. And they just, essentially do the same thing 4 years later. But, in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, this is a time where we see an opportunity for improved relations. And so in 2008, 2009, you have the so-called reset done under the Obama administration to try to improve relations. We try to shut down some of these offensive systems that are, this missile defense system that Russia had been complaining about under the Bush administration. And so it looks like things are getting back on track again. However, then you have the global financial crisis. Then you have a whole lot of smaller elements that are really impacting Russia's economy. And one of the things you find is that, one of the reasons why Putin's popularity in Russia, he has been very popular. His approval ratings are usually around 70 to 80% approval ratings, and that's not manufactured. That's actually quite genuine. A lot of that just reflects the fact that he's delivering the goods in terms of the economic improvement. Throughout the 2000s, Russia's economy grew at the rate of 7 to 9% per year for an entire decade. And so that's seen as being a genuine improvement. People who couldn't afford, to make ends meet are suddenly financially secure. They're able to travel more. So this is seen as very liberalizing in that way. We don't see it as much. We see, Putin, the autocrat. Russians see that as improvement. Life is getting better. Maybe I don't have as many options in terms of, free and accessible media, but my life is getting quite a bit better. So there's quite a bit of support for that. Now, that tends to start to falter, first with the global financial crisis, and then with a number of sort of tit-for-tat sanctions that are going on after 2013, 2014 in particular, with the Euromaidan revolution, and then with Russia's annexation of Crimea and sort of meddling in eastern Ukraine. And we can talk about that a little bit later on if we want to. So one of these things that happens is obviously Russia annexes the Crimean Peninsula, which is a gorgeous place. I spent some time there. And that's obviously a huge violation of international law and international norms. It's the first time you've had the forcible redrawing of boundaries anywhere in Europe since World War II. So that's a big deal. Whether we care, whether the Crimeans want to be part of Russia or Ukraine, that kind of violation, you just can't let that sort of thing go. So we impose a number of economic sanctions, targeted economic sanctions against Russia. They retaliate with counter-sanctions against some American leaders and refuse to import certain agricultural products from the European Union, which actually hurts their economy more than the EU or the United States. So this is hurting Russia's economy. These sanctions are actually biting quite a bit. And as part of that, you start to have a turn in when Putin comes back to the presidency in 2014, 2016, that sort of era. He's no longer sort of this economic populist. He's not the guy who's delivering the goods because the economy's flatlined. You're not having this exponential growth anymore. And so he starts to make a turn from legitimacy by economic performance to legitimacy by nationalism. The whole idea behind sort of invading and annexing Crimea and meddling in those eastern areas of Ukraine where they're predominantly Russian speakers is a nationalist movement, right? We need to protect the Russian speakers. We are there because this is Russian civilization against those horrible Westerners that are out there. And so this is one of the things that you start to have in this situation. And instead of getting better with the 2016 election, in response to these violations by Russia and these sanctions and these counter-sanctions, things continue to get worse and worse and worse, despite Trump's, best intents to try to improve relations. So that's just kind of, the up and down of U.S.-Russian relations. So just again, in terms of, these are just some other slides that I have here in terms of trying to understand the context. You have this dramatic modernization under, the first two terms of Putin, right through the 2011. And this leads to all sorts of benefits, right? You start to have Russians who are consumers. You're starting to have a middle class because throughout most of the 1990s, and I think this is where Putin gets a lot of his popularity and his panache, is that people remember the 1990s very vividly. I spent a lot of time in Russia in the 1990s. It was not bad for me as a foreigner because I had some money. And I could, even as a student, I didn't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from. A lot of Russians did. The economic collapse after the Soviet Union just decimated the economy. There was no middle class anymore. You were either an ultra-rich oligarch or you were dirt poor. There was nothing in between. I mean, a little bit, for the most part, speaking a little bit of hyperbole here. But, under Putin, things are generally getting better. You're starting to have people who can afford apartments, they can afford foreign vacations. They're starting to live a little bit more comfortably. And one of the things we understand from political science is, as you have this modernization, people are going to start to want to protect their investments, as it were, right? You want to make sure that our leaders aren't doing horribly stupid things like tanking the economy. So you're going to get involved. You're going to start protesting more. And so in the more recent years under Putin, these people, especially in the big cities, in Moscow and to a lesser extent St. Petersburg, are starting to turn out in protests, popular protests. They're starting to recognize, especially the youth, sort of the high school age kids, college age kids, into their 30s, who've only known Putin and Putinism, and are understandably tired of the cronyism and the corruption that they see every day. They're looking off to Europe, and they're looking to the United States, and they're saying, with the access, they all have cell phones now, they all have internet access, they can see what the rest of the world looks like, and they're wondering why our country doesn't look like that. Why are we stuck in this corrupt system? Why are we stuck in this? And so they're starting to protest in droves in many cases, right? And so what this leads to, I guess, from a political perspective, is that there's less of a demand for a paternalistic state, right? We don't need Putin to protect us anymore. We can look after ourselves, thank you very much. And you start to have more of the civic activism, more people protesting, more people volunteering to be election monitors at local polling places and so on. And there's starting to be more of a use of these things called arbitration courts, arbitrage sud. And that suggests there's more of a respect for the rule of law in more recent years as well. And so things are generally getting better. And then all of a sudden it all comes crashing down, or at least kind of flatlines, stagnates. The economy's done. And with the ruble collapse in 2014, 2015, as a result of these economic sanctions, people are starting to get really upset. And so Putin's numbers are going down and down and down. And that's one reason we think why he's stoking kind of this Russian nationalist rhetoric. It's kind of a rally around the flag effect. I am the state. I am Putin. To be pro-Russia is to be pro-Putin. And so there's kind of this understanding. There's a lot of discussion nowadays about what Russia will look like after Putin. But for the moment, it's hard to conceptualize. It's hard to imagine who could possibly step into his shoes and deal with all this. And so So this is what you start to have in this time frame, is this kind of amping up of anti-Western rhetoric, this nationalism. Here's a copy of the Moscow Times from 2011 there. Putin, you can see the headline there. This is, I guess, when the Yaroslavl hockey team went down in a plane crash the same day there. That you start to have all these protests. And the way this gets stoked up in Russia is, especially with state-run media, is that we need a scapegoat. And the universal scapegoat is the United States. And this gets fed into sort of the Russian media echo chamber, and it just reverberates and reverberates. And so it seems like every single thing that goes wrong is somehow a conspiracy that was orchestrated, usually by Barack Obama, but for a long time it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. She was the villain in all these different things. I remember I was in Russia in 2014 or so, and I was at this conference in Villanova, which is a 6-hour drive outside of Moscow, and they gave me a cabbie on the way back. So it's a 6-hour cab ride, if you can imagine. It was ridiculous. But we were listening to like Moscow talk radio, and it was the same time. I don't know if you remember this, a number of years ago. There was a Russian airliner that got shot down over Egypt, right? And so it got shot down. This was all just breaking news, and it was just conspiracy central, and they were just listening to the point where I was blown away, And so this is kind of before the fake news era in the United States, and so it was something you could go and watch, that same sort of dynamic that we have now. But it was over there in Russia, and so I remember driving back with this cabbie this whole way, and he's like, I bet you it was Hillary Clinton who shot down that plane. I'm like, come on, really? It just went down. Why don't you wait till we have some facts? And but this guy was absolutely certain that day that it was a conspiracy by the United States to shoot down that airliner. And he kept telling me over and over again, he's like, we better not find out that it was you Americans who shot down our plane and Hillary Clinton shot down our plane because, our Putin is a great and kind and loving leader, but he also has a vindictive side, and you Americans will find out the hard way if we find out that you shot down our airplane. I'm like, literally, it happened 5 minutes ago. We have no... But that's just kind of the conspiracy. Everything ties back to Hillary Clinton, not just sort of in the public sphere and this conspiracy theory land, but also apparently within the upper echelons of Putin's government. And so this is important to understand as the context as we're getting into the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that there was a very persistent anti-Hillary Clinton narrative that goes way back. You can see this, like I said, this is from 2011, is this, this clip here.
Vladimir Putin has accused Hillary Clinton of instigating protests in Russia. Why don't they just do it already?
So, but that's just kind of the context, and it's always there. It's this constant element that's going on, and so this is kind of the background for this whole thing. We don't need to go into all that. Skip ahead because we have other things to do. So that's kind of the context for why Russia, and particular Putin, and like I said, I'm not privy, I'm not in his mind, I'm not in the Kremlin, but this is the context for understanding the politics of what's going on in the lead up to 2015, 2016. I don't think that Vladimir Putin has any particular affinity for Donald Trump. In fact, he's suggested just the opposite. If anything, from the Russia side, the interest has been in either tarnishing Clinton's victory, because it was assumed by pretty much everybody, including the Trump campaign, that Clinton was going to win. This was a way of undermining Clinton, a Hillary Clinton presidency, and tarnishing it in some way by stoking all of these particular accusations. And so that was the idea. I don't think they expected Trump to win, just like Trump really didn't expect to win. And so it's been interesting to watch this whole thing kind of develop. And so one of the things that we have in the West in particular, we have this image of Vladimir Putin as this omnipotent leader, right? This guy who's playing 47-dimension chess, and we're all over here playing checkers. He knows everything. He's the mastermind of everything. He is He is Kaiser Sose. He is Thanos. He is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He's like this omnipotent thing. And I think that's problematic because I don't think he's like that. In fact, I don't think he has this strategic vision where he can see 47 steps down what's going to happen. I think he's a very strategic thinker. I think he's kind of, he kind of shoots from the hip and makes decisions as they're coming. And so it's been very interesting to see, especially after 2016, after Trump gets elected, and after you have this investigation into election meddling, as to what Russia's actually doing with it, because it's certainly not embracing Trump. In fact, it's quite a bit of the opposite. So, anyway, so as I mentioned before, like when throughout the election, people are always asking, what's Russia up to? What's the angle on all this? And as I mentioned before, I just was like, I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and I don't want to get out in front of this because I don't want to say anything stupid. But when the Mueller report actually did come out, like I said, as soon as it came out, I was reading through the entire thing, and I ended up writing a piece for Foreign Policy magazine that got quite a bit of traction. Everybody, as you remember, back in April when the Mueller report was actually published, everybody goes diving into this and starts writing all these different things. And 99.9% of the analyses that you see of the Mueller report are focused on Trump. They're focused on, because that's what it's all about, right? What did Trump know and when? What were the cover-ups? What was these Trump Tower meetings about? Who knew what? I was more interested in figuring out, with the benefit of all this research and information from the CIA, from foreign intelligence agencies, I want to know what's going on the other side. I'm interested in what's driving this whole thing. And so I wrote this piece that they always change the titles, but they ended up titling it, Mueller's bombshells are about Putin, not about Trump. Okay, well, that's kind of what it's about. And I kind of wanted to share it as kind of my introduction to like the Russia angle on this whole intervention, right? So we know sort of the broad outlines of election meddling. We can talk a little bit about some of these, but again, I was kind of interested on it from the Russian angle, and so this is kind of where we're going with this. Like I said, he's been conspicuously absent. Putin's always absent from these discussions. The focus is always on Trump as well. And as I said, since the 2016 election, all investigative journalists have been playing the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game, except trying to link Putin to Trump, right? Who's the intermediary? Who's talking to who? Who has Putin's ear? Who's meeting with Trump? And so is it Trump to Michael Flynn, to Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak to Putin, or Trump to George Papadopoulos, to Joseph Mifsud to Putin? What is this? With Trump and Paul Manafort, his campaign advisor to the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska? What is all this, right? So I was interested in how do we draw those connections, and we can spend some time talking about these. And so if you read the Mueller report, it's fascinating. The whole thing is utterly fascinating from a lot of different angles. The first section of it articulates what we know from the intelligence side about what Russia was up to. The first particular angle on this is what was known as the Internet Research Agency, the so-called troll farm located in St. Petersburg that we already knew about well before the Mueller report came out, because Mueller had sent out these indictments. There were 13 Russian nationals who were associated with this, trying to intervene and meddle in the elections by essentially sowing discord online in particular, having these bots and these trolls on Twitter and on Facebook, coming up with all sorts of different different events, trying to sow discord between the Bernie Sanders people and the Hillary Clinton people, trying to stoke division between Republicans and Democrats, especially around sensitive immigration issues. And also, there's a lot that was going on the ground in these particular cases. It wasn't just something that was happening in St. Petersburg, Russia. Actually, it was also happening in St. Petersburg, Florida. Some of these operatives were actually putting together sort of these fake kind of grassroots meetings in places like Florida that actually had some outreach to various Trump supporters. One of these I thought was particularly interesting because one of my friends from grad school, who teaches now at the University of Tampa Bay down in Florida, she was also running for state-level government for the state senate in Florida. As it turns out, one of the people named in the indictment was the Trump campaign manager who, knowingly or unknowingly, was setting up some of these sort of hyper-nationalist, anti-immigrant meetings with the help of some of these Russian nationals. And so I was looking at this, and I'm like, I had to text my friend Liv. I'm like, hey, isn't that the guy you're running against in your Senate seat? Like, oh, yeah. Oh, he seems to be in this Mueller Report thing. So it's fascinating. You know, I'm doing my own 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon with these sorts of things. So that was one, right? So we already knew about that. We knew about the troll farms. We can spend some time about that. I have this little icon up there on the right. And if we want to spend some time going on that, we can go off in that direction. The second area, chronicles the operation of particular specific cyber warfare units of the GRU, which is Russian Foreign Intelligence. And so this is the one where you have the hacking of the Democratic National Convention, their emails, and all of a sudden these go missing. They end up being published on WikiLeaks with Julian Assange and all that. This was all done very high level. We had a roundtable a few months ago with some experts in cybersecurity and cyber warfare who were, telling me exactly they could determine based upon sort of these signature traits of who was doing this and where they were doing it from, and they could tell even by the time frame that these attacks were always being coordinated at a specific time frame when it was around 2:00 in Moscow, and it was happening obviously in the middle of the night here in the United States. And so it was interesting to see that. We could spend some time talking about that as well. We can click on that little icon there. That's the GRU logo. I kid you not. It is not Batman. It is really the logo that they use. I can't make that up. All right. And so the third avenue that's out there is the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game. Who was in contact with Trump and the Trump campaign? Were they actively trying to solicit dirt on Hillary Clinton? Whether we're talking about Michael Cohen, whether we're talking about Michael Flynn, all these different ones, Paul Manafort, and so on. Somebody on Pinterest did this. This is a while ago. You can go find these on Pinterest. Somebody made 1987 Topps baseball cards of all the people involved in the Trump scandal, which is so fantastic. One, because I loved baseball cards when I was a kid, and that was my prime time. But also, it's great because it allows you to put names and faces with people in a particular way. And so we could go and do a little bit, if we want to, in the Q&A time, try to investigate some of these particular linkages. We can do that. However, like I said, my interest was not so much on that. Everybody else can get that. You can watch CNN and get that. You can read Politico and get all those sorts of things. I was more interested in what the Mueller Report tells us about Russia, and it did not fail us in this particular way. And the most interesting testimony was from this guy's name's Peter Avin. He was the head of Alpha Bank. I think he still is. A top-level Russian oligarch who actually sat down for interviews with the Mueller team. This is nowhere reported in anything because, again, we're all focused so much on Russia, on Trump and on what's going on over here. We don't even look at what's going on over there. And so he was, according to this testimony, he was giving firsthand accounts of his interactions with Vladimir Putin. And these interactions are the first time we get any sort of idea as to what was motivating Putin, how this whole thing kind of plays out. And so they would have these routine kind of high-level meetings with, as an economic oligarch, as a head of, one of Russia's top banks. Obviously there's a lot of cronyism and corruption that goes with these sorts of things. So, in fact, you can go, I actually did, you can go to the Kremlin website, and it actually has pictures of these meetings because these are all kind of open source there. So this is one of the meetings that Peter Avin there on the right has with Vladimir Putin, where they start to discuss some of this. Now, according to this testimony, these one-on-one meetings in 2016, Putin warns Avin that the United States might impose additional sanctions on Russia. That's the concern in 2016. And that he should take all possible steps to protect himself, to protect Russia, and to protect his bank. Those are the three altogether. The thing highlighted here is Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Avon, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom to formally speak and generally did not know people around the president-elect. Such evidence is clearly at odds with the imagery that we have of Putin as this all-seeing, all-knowing puppet master of United States politics, that Putin himself is confiding to these oligarchs that we don't know anything about this Trump guy. We don't know how to get in contact with him. Maybe you should try. Maybe try to get buddy-buddy and see if you can make contact through one way or another. So Avon even describes Putin responding with some skepticism about his prospects for success. They have all these other meetings there to try to make contact. In particular, he makes contact with this guy Dmitry Medvedev, who's up there on the top left. He thinks that he's a scholar of Russia, works in a bunch of Washington think tanks. He's from Russia, and Avon knows that Dmitry Medvedev has relations, friendly relations with Jared Kushner, obviously Trump's son-in-law. So he's hoping to meet Medvedev to get to Kushner through Medvedev, so that they can figure out some way to maybe lessen the economic impact of some of these economic sanctions that are coming down the way. Ultimately, nothing comes of that because already by 2016, people know about the Russian connection. Symes in particular says, I don't want anything to do with this. You leave me out of it. And so that whole thing kind of falls apart. And again, why I find this particularly interesting is that it reveals to us that Putin, again, is not this all-seeing, all-knowing guy who's directing everything from the Kremlin, but also the difficulties that they're having in trying to maintain some contacts that are out there. And he's not the only one. There's another Russian, this guy Kirill Dmitriev, there he is right there, from another meeting on the Kremlin webpage with Putin. He is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so with all of that oil and natural gas revenues that they got throughout the 2000s, a lot of that they put into a rainy day fund, which grew into many billions, if not trillions of dollars, and they've been kind of drawing on since. So this is a very important guy. He's the banker who's in charge of literally billions and trillions of dollars of Russia. And so he gets called into Putin's office as well to talk about what's going on there. According to the reports, Dmitriev was also very anxious to connect with the incoming administration and thought he could contact either Donald Trump Jr. or Jared Kushner. And he tried on a couple of occasions, but apparently was unable to do so. And so Dmitriev ultimately reports in the Mueller Report that he was disappointed on not being able to meet a more important representative from the Trump team and that they could not actually go deeper into substance. So you have in this report a couple of these cases of, for lack of a better term, sort of abortive attempts to try to make contact with Russia. And the last one I wanted to mention here, in terms of the Russian angle on this, is the obvious one. You say, okay, you're the head of Russia. You've got an entire diplomatic corps. You've got your foreign minister. You've got an ambassador. If you want to go meet the president-elect or even the candidate before him, why not go through your ambassador? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? So the ambassador in Russia is this in Washington, D.C., or was until very recently, this guy, Sergei Kislyak. There he is on the top card where he's shaking Donald Trump's hand, which is apparently incriminating evidence. Everybody's like, oh my God, he has Russian contacts. He met with the Russian ambassador. I've met Kislyak. He was in Philadelphia a couple of years ago. And so, but now apparently I'm a Russian agent. I can't say that I met Kislyak because now they're going to cast aspersions at me and say, oh, he's secretly a Kremlin plant. Look at him talking about Putin in ways that aren't evil and conniving and stuff. Anyway, so what's fascinating about that is that if you read the Mueller report with regards to Kislyak, he's very seldom in there, which is strange because he's always in the American, the media landscape, talking about, did Michael Flynn meet with Kislyak, and did Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he secretly met with Kislyak on a number of occasions. Like that's a very nefarious thing. Well, apparently Kislyak was completely out of the loop on all of this. And there is a lot of this there. There's a lot of connections that we can talk about, but most of them had nothing to do with Kislyak, which is strange because you would think that would be the point person on this. And so while Kislyak, as the report says, was an important person, he did not have a direct line to Putin. Other informal oligarch intermediaries, such as Putin aide Yuri Ushakov and the head of Vneshekonombank, head Sergei Gorkov, became necessary intermediaries in these particular cases. And so, again, that's just kind of my own background into this. I was fascinated by the Mueller Report because it gives me a lot of details that I otherwise would not have in my study of what's going on in Russia, not so much on the American side. But it also does affirm a lot of the understandings that we have of how Russia works and how Putin's system works. That it's much more, it's an informalized system of connections. And so we're right to look at particular oligarchs, people who have strong connections to Putin in particular, because in the Russian system, access is everything. Right, that's how you can go from a lot of the people who are in Putin's inner circle. A lot of people who grew up with Putin back in Leningrad in the old Soviet days, who were in the same, played, I guess, wrestled together, had judo together, who are all part of the same dojo, suddenly are multi-billionaires. How does that work? Well, you ask them, they say, well, Putin knows a lot of people, and they say, well, it seems like you're getting rich because you know Putin, and Putin is giving you, all these choice economic opportunities and development opportunities and kickback opportunities. And they'll just say, well, Putin knows a lot of people. I just happen to be really close friends with him, and now I'm a multi-billionaire, So we're right to make those connections because there is a lot of this quid pro quo, a lot of, corruption that goes with that sort of thing. And so it's fascinating to see how those informal ties and informal mechanisms of government are actually more important than the formal mechanisms of government, the formal diplomatic relations that we have in each of these particular cases. And so that was really interesting to me to see. These informal mechanisms and solutions even are more important than things like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because that's how Putin rolls. That's how the Putin system works. It's very disorganized, very shady, and it's a lot of it is based upon bonds of trust between people. That's the key, is who is there that I can trust. And so I'm not sure if I can trust somebody who's loyal to Russia, who has a government position, who is the ambassador. I need somebody who's personally loyal to me as an individual. And so I think that's something that sort of the Putinist system and what we're seeing, I guess, now in the revelations with Trump, they both have that same sort of trust connection. It's kind of like a mob boss mentality. I need people who are personally trustworthy and loyal to me as an individual. So where are we at? Oh, we're already blowing through. So we talked a little bit about the different elements. We talked about very briefly the Russian story. I can skip ahead on some of these. We don't have to go through all these. I'll give you a quick example because it's relevant of how this whole thing kind of plays out. The one element that is most interesting to me is the Internet Research Agency one. And this is back in February 2018. You had the Mueller indictment against this troll farm, this Internet Research Agency, plus 13 other Russians, none of whom will probably ever step foot in the United States or ever see the inside of an American courtroom based upon this. But the idea was that they were trying to interfere in U.S. electoral processes, and they were also charged with sort of wire fraud, identity theft, sort of impersonating an American, if you will. And so they were trying to ultimately support the Trump campaign on this. Again, not because I don't think they really love Trump by any stretch of the imagination, but they were trying to denigrate Hillary Clinton in that. And so this project was spearheaded by this guy named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's there on the right. People talk about him as Putin's chef, because apparently everybody needs a nickname in this whole thing. Fascinating guy. So really quick, we don't need to get into that. That's my little backgrounder on that. If you want to know a little bit about Prigozhin, who's under indictment according to the United States, he was born in Leningrad in 1961, lived in the Soviet Union was brought up in that period. In the 90s, he spent 9 years in prison for robbery and bank fraud and all sorts of stuff. So not a great guy to be working with. When the communism collapses in Leningrad, he starts with a hot dog stand, like a little mobile hot dog stand, and kind of builds up his business. By the mid-1990s, he has a whole bunch of these hot dog stands all over that are making money, and he starts to make them into kind of upstanding restaurants. And so he wants to have like a five-star restaurant. And Leningrad, or St. Petersburg as it is now, that's where Putin is from, right? And so he wants to show off his city. He finds himself coming back to St. Petersburg all the time. And all of a sudden now we have a five-star restaurant. So he's constantly patronizing the only five-star restaurant in St. Petersburg. And this guy's, every time Putin comes, Prigozhin is there like waiting on him literally as a personal waiter. Putin really likes this, and so he just keeps going up and up and up. He's hosting meetings between Putin and Jacques Chirac and George W. Bush when he comes, and he's constantly building his economic empire there. He has this thing called Concord Catering, his business. By the mid-2000s, he's getting government contracts left and right. And in 2012, he gets a $1.2 billion contract to serve food for the entire Russian military for the year. So again, just an example of how you go from nothing, but Putin likes you, here's $1.2 billion, and making all sorts of money from this. So he's got this massive compound, he's got a jet, he's got the yacht, he's got everything that goes with that sort of thing. And so going back to 2014, he starts to siphon off some of this money to fund this internet research agency that's there ostensibly to just sow discord online in American elections. And so that just gives you kind of an idea on the ground of how these things sort of build up from the Russian perspective in that particular case. So we got a little bit more time here. The other thing I really wanted to hop on really quickly before we kind of move over and open things up for question and answer is how this whole thing comes to play in like the last couple of weeks. Because there's a lot going on in Ukraine, which obviously is not Russia. It's next door. And what's fascinating is that Ukraine has been on the opposite side. We've been trying to help Ukraine a lot in their relations with, in opposition to Putin and Russia. Because again, in 2013, you have this Euromaidan revolution. They get rid of their this guy Viktor Yanukovych, who was their crony, tin pot dictator. You have this popular revolution that gets rid of him. And as it turns out, when they start to investigate all the documents that he left behind, one of his top advisors was this guy named Paul Manafort, who goes on from being Yanukovych's top advisor to being Donald Trump's top advisor, and now he's in federal prison, as we know. So one of the things apparently that's been happening is that there was this suggestion that one way to undermine the legitimacy of the Mueller Report ahead of the 2020 elections, because that's going to be something that was going to be an issue in 2020 regardless of who Trump goes against, is these outstanding accusations regarding to the Mueller Report. There's been this effort to undermine the Mueller Report by going to Ukraine and trying to discredit all the information that they could find, trying to dig up dirt to do that. And apparently, when they were doing that, Rudy Giuliani was the guy, I guess, who was the point person in this whole thing, is that they were... there's this accusation that's been out there that Vice President Joe Biden, his son, was involved, Hunter Biden was involved in this thing called, this natural gas company called Burisma, which had some corruption allegations behind it. And so that was the accusation that when he was working as vice president for Barack Obama, Joe Biden was pressuring the Ukrainians to fire their independent anti-corruption prosecutor, this guy Viktor Shokhin, because he was going after Biden's son. That's the accusation. As it turns out, there's no evidence of that. Two, the allegations against Burisma were allegations that were made 2 years before Hunter Biden even went to Ukraine, and so that was problematic. But the reality is that the President Petro Poroshenko the prosecutor was actually fired for not being active enough against corruption and not prosecuting enough corruption in that particular case. And in fact, this investigation into Burisma was actually lying dormant, and they were trying to get him to fight corruption in all these particular cases. And so the new prosecutor general under Petro Poroshenko, the guy after Shokin, this guy Yuri Lutsenko, actually has come out and said, Hunter Biden cannot be responsible for violations of management that took place 2 years before he actually arrived. And so what actually happens at this point in time, early in 2019, with that guy Lutsenko down at the bottom, he's the new guy in charge of the anti-corruption crusade. And apparently Giuliani is going to Ukraine, trying to dig up more dirt on this potential Biden connection, trying to figure out if he can undermine the Mueller report with those relations with Manafort and Yanukovych. So apparently Giuliani, and he's got his own baseball card there as well, has a lot of meetings with this Lutsenko guy in particular, because he is the new guy, right? He's the guy who just came into power, and there is a lot of power that comes from not only being representing the United States, but also representing the president, being his personal attorney. And so he's going hard after Lutsenko. He's pushing on him very hard to dig up anything he can on the Bidens and to discredit the Mueller report. And then something, that's about the same time you start to hear these rumors, like on Fox News, that, what's this Ukraine thing all about? What's Biden up to? No substantiation, just rumors that are kind of into the echo chamber. But then something weird happens. April 2019, Petro Poroshenko loses his election to this guy, Volodymyr Zelensky. There he is on the left. Fascinating guy in his own right. You think he got crazy politics here with reality TV stars. Zelensky is, he was actually a comedian who had a Ukrainian television show where he goes from being a teacher to becoming the president of Ukraine. It becomes a hit television show about becoming the president of Ukraine, and then as an actor, he runs for president of Ukraine and becomes president of Ukraine. It's insane. So he wins in a landslide. He wins, 70% of the votes. Steamrolls Poroshenko, and there's, to the credit to the Ukrainians, a peaceful transition of power from Poroshenko to Zelensky. Now this puts Giuliani in a bind, because the guy that he was working with this whole time is now out of the picture. So what do you do? And so all that trying to curry favor with Lutsenko is now moot. And this is where you start to have a series of... I had it there. Okay. You have a series of interesting maneuvers, right? So you have May 6th, you have Trump recalls the American ambassador, a lifelong civil servant, foreign service officer, Marie Yovanovitch. And because apparently she was really into the anti-corruption thing. She had been pushing hard, seriously, to prosecute corruption, and that can't possibly be going. So that was one thing. May 10th, Giuliani then cancels his trip to Ukraine to go do more kind of investigations. And the big one was May 14th for the inauguration of the new president. We usually send delegates. Usually we send the president, so we were going to send Vice President Pence. We scuttle that. Clear signal that we do not like what's going on. And then July 18th, we take the promised $391 million in military aid that's used to buy American weapons to fight against Russians. We just suddenly put that on hold, as a clear indication that we don't, like what's going on. There's Pence in his baseball card as well. What's fascinating at this time is that we all know this now because what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. There's this guy. If you want to follow anybody about Ukraine, this is the guy, Simon Ostrovsky. When the crap was hitting the fan a couple of years ago in Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass, he was on the ground. He was a Vice News reporter giving daily dispatches in war zones. He knows Ukraine inside and out. So he posted the other day, he's like, not saying I called this, but I called this. And then he links to his other tweets from before, from May 18th, this May 18th tweet from Rudy Giuliani. It says, this is a test. Giuliani's tweeting about this in May. This is a test for President-elect Zelensky. He already surrounded himself with some people that are enemies of President Trump. Now this notorious oligarch is said to have people around him. Kolominsky should be prosecuted for that. Let's see. Well, it tells us a lot about control. Now, Ostrovsky's looking at this and says, this is unusual. This is not the kind of, this is our ally. We're not supposed to be saying stuff that you're an enemy of Trump, you're an enemy of our guy. It sounds a lot like Trump's personal lawyer is threatening a foreign elected leader to get him to investigate his boss's main political rival. This tweet is not really about Kolominsky, it's about Biden. This is Ostrovsky calling that back in May. So, months before any of us caught, I didn't catch wind of this at all, right? So, but he's going about this whole thing. And saying, hey, you're putting Ukraine in a horrible bind. You thought that Zelensky, as a newly elected leader, is going to have his big foreign policy challenge is going to be Putin because you got Russian troops stationed on your territory. All of a sudden, your first foreign policy challenge is from your ally, the United States, because you're not doing enough to dig up dirt on Trump's political rival. So this is very, very strange that's going on there. And then, of course, this leads us up to the notorious call of July 25th, where there is this very clear kind of quid pro quo of, we're great friends of you, we have all this military aid, but I would like you to do us a favor, though. I would like you to investigate corruption. People are talking, always this plausible deniability, like, people are talking about this Hunter Biden situation, and we would like to know more about that. So this is the one that happens, and as it turns out, we're finding more and more about this all the time. We're finding out that Mike Pompeo was on the call, that Bill Barr was involved in this. Mike Pence might have some as well. Then you have the whistleblower reports that are coming out. The whistleblower reports are also fascinating. It's like a Mueller report in like hyperspace, right? It's only like 8 pages. You don't have to read 400, and it's everything. It's all right there. Quite clearly. A couple things that came of it from my own aspects, and some of this is obviously getting out there. One is that that the standard operating procedure was to cover this up, to put it on a secret server that's for national intelligence matters, even though there was no issues of national security or intelligence on this particular call. And two was the notion that, as the whistleblower says, throughout all the conversations between Ukraine and Giuliani and Ukraine and Trump on corruption, there was only ever one case ever mentioned. There was never another case of corruption that was ever mentioned. It was all about Hunter Biden and this allegation that was out there. And so even the whistleblower is like, it's crystal clear. There's no plausible deniability that, this is just one of many cases that we're interested in. There's only one case when it comes to these sorts of allegations, right?
July 25th, which, by the way, happened the day after Mueller's testimony to Congress. We think it's worthy of this, but all of those actions leads us to, I would like you to do us a favor, though. This was about what?
Well, this is about President Trump asking President Zelensky to help him find dirt on his political opponent in 2020. It's clear as day in the transcript. And there is leverage there. Whether exactly what they knew, I don't think is important. There is always leverage when you're talking to the President of the United States because all leaders of the world want to have a good relationship with the president. It's especially important when your country is occupied by Putin and you need the leader of the free world to be on your side. And when anybody says, let me ask for a favor, there's no favors in diplomacy.
Right.
Everything is a quid pro quo.
Right.
Everything is you do this, I'll help you.
Well, this triggers, obviously, a whole bunch of concern. The whistleblower first goes to his general counsel at CIA. Then he's worried it's going to get squashed. Files the whistleblower complaint. The House begins an investigation. The administration does release the aid to Ukraine very quickly. But at this point, it seems to be too late. And then we find out, of course, this is all about Ukraine.
So one last thing, and I'll wrap it up and we'll open things up for questions. And so those are just things, just in case I forgot. I sometimes write these things out for me. And so it's interesting to see where these things are going. I'm following this like with bated breath on a daily basis, trying to figure out where all this goes. The last thing I'll mention really quickly there, the guy who was talking, that was Michael McFaul. He's actually a professor of political science at Stanford. He's a friend of mine who also then got involved as a political advisor to candidate Barack Obama, becomes an advisor on diplomatic international affairs, and then becomes the U.S. ambassador to Russia for a 3-year span as a lot of this stuff is going down. And so it's fascinating that even as part of this back and forth between the United States and Russia, with these sanctions that keep going back and forth, McFaul is one of the only guys who is on like the Russian no-fly list. He's sanctioned in Russia. He cannot legally go back to Russia because he's loathed by Putin and the Russians. And in fact, if you remember about a year ago when you had that first meeting in Helsinki between Trump and Putin, and everybody is like, what's going on here? Apparently in one of these conversations, Trump said something like, they were talking about the Mueller Report, and Putin asked if he could have access to certain Americans for interrogations. And McFaul was the guy he was talking about. And so it's fascinating to watch him like in real time. And then later he finds out about it because he's covering it for NBC News. It's like, wait, it was me they're talking? Crazy. This whole thing is crazy. And I'd love to talk more about it, but I want to address any questions that you might have. So.